First of all, I want to ask you about the Chinese economy. We saw the figure, 4.8% growth year on year in the first quarter, but much of the growth actually comes from the first 2 months. What do you make of the 4.8% figure?
Well, look, as you already mentioned, clearly most of the growth comes from the first 2 months, and those first 2 months really relied on a lot of growth impulse coming from the last quarter of last year, where the government really ramped up its spending on infrastructure and where there was some loosening of monetary policy. That you see back in the first 2 months. March, in almost all accounts, except for infrastructure, on almost all accounts of high-frequent data, they are less positive than the first 2 months. Most worrisome is retail sales, which actually saw a decline, but also imports that were basically flat. And that means that domestic demand is really weakening compared to the first 2 months. So it is of concern. And you mentioned, in part, that's the lockdowns and the war in the Ukraine, but they came in quite late into March. So I have to say, I think there will be more pain ahead as these measures, as the war and the COVID lockdown measures will spill over into April and maybe later.
Well, I want to ask you, this zero COVID policy China has been pursuing for years, actually. How do you look at China's dynamic zero COVID policy's impact on the Chinese economy? Because one argument is that acute pain is better than chronic suffering. But what do you really think?
Well, look, dynamic COVID was very successful until quite recently. And China was the first one to recover from the impact of COVID. They were the first one that continued growth in 2020, whereas the whole world economy was in negative growth territory. But the Omicron variant has changed a lot. The zero COVID is simply not enough to stop Omicron, and as we've seen, we get more and more lockdowns. So that's a major risk. The other effect of the very effective zero COVID was that a lot of people actually didn't bother to vaccinate. And I think China has some catch up to do in vaccination, and a big vaccination drive as zero COVID is being implemented is one of the highest priorities for the Chinese government at the moment.